Don't take one more step. 3 hunted Apache women had cornered themselves in the cabin Reuben just bought, and finding them would change his life forever, though he had no way of knowing that yet, standing frozen in a doorway with his hands starting to lift. $20 was what the cabin had cost him, $20 and a signature, for a stretch of land at the foot of the Chalk Bluff Mountains that the seller in Larkspur Hollow had unloaded with a strange, hurried smile. The kind of smile a man gives when he's glad to be rid of something rather than proud to be selling it. Reuben hadn't asked why. 28 years old, no family left to speak of, no direction that mattered more than any other. He'd simply handed over the last of his savings and ridden 2 hours out from town with a mule loaded down with what little he owned, telling himself a man his age ought to have 4 walls of his own by now, whatever state they came in. The deed was still folded in his coat pocket, the ink barely dry, when Reuben pushed through weeds grown chest-high around the porch steps and set his boot against a door that hadn't been opened in the better part of a year. It swung inward on a groan of rusted hinges, and the smell that met him was damp wood and cold ash and something else underneath it, something living. He stood in the doorway a long moment, one hand still on the frame, letting his eyes adjust to the gray afternoon light leaking through a broken shutter. Dust hung in the air like it hadn't decided yet whether to settle. And then from the back room, so quiet he nearly mistook it for wind, working through a gap in the boards, came a woman's voice, low and urgent, hushing someone else. A careful man would have backed straight out. Instead, Reuben crossed the front room, slow, spurs silent because he'd wrapped cloth around the rowels out of trail habit, and pushed the second door open with 2 fingers. 3 pairs of dark eyes found him in the gloom and did not blink. The tallest of the 3 came up off the floor so fast it was as though she'd never been sitting at all, putting her body between him and the 2 behind her, both hands raised, not surrender, he understood at once, but readiness, fingers curled like she meant to use them as weapons if it came to that. "I hear you." Both his palms went up, empty, and he stopped where he stood. "I'm not here to hurt anybody. I didn't even know you were here." She didn't lower her hands. Behind her, the shorter haired of the other 2, cropped ragged, like it had been cut in a hurry with a knife rather than shears, had gone rigid against the wall, watching him with a distrust so total it had a shape to it. A wall he could feel from 6 feet away. The third, softest faced of the group had drawn her knees to her chest and wrapped both arms around them, shaking, whether from cold or fear he couldn't have said. All 3 were thin past hungry, into something closer to starving, clothes torn and gray with trail dust. And in the corner he could make out a nest of old blankets, the picked bones of something small, a rabbit maybe, and a tin cup holding rainwater. "This is our house. We got here first." "I bought it 2 hours ago." Something in his own voice surprised him. How little like a man laying claim to property it came out. "Off a fellow in town who didn't think much of it. Reckon he didn't know you were in here either, or he'd have mentioned it." He let his hands stay lifted. "Are you hungry?" The question landed strange, too plain, too ordinary for the moment, and something flickered across the tall woman's face, not softening yet, but caught off guard. Behind her, the softest-faced one made a small sound, her stomach betraying her loud enough for all 3 to hear, and for one heartbeat, something close to shame crossed the tall one's expression before she buried it again. "It isn't charity. Man rides a long trail. He ought to share what he's got. That's all this is. Her name, he'd learned before the sun went down, was Sikya, and in the weeks that followed, she would tell him it was the space of that single line. Not the food, not the empty hands, but it isn't charity, it's sharing, that made her decide, against every hard lesson 3 stolen towns had taught her, not to put a knife in him the moment his back was turned. He backed slow to where his horse stood, cropping the weeds by the porch, and came back with what he had. A heel of bread wrapped in cloth, a strip of dried beef, 4 wrinkled apples from the bottom of his saddlebag. He set it all on the floorboards between them and stepped back to the doorway, giving them room, and watched the 2 younger women look to Sikya first, waiting on some signal before they moved. When she gave the smallest of nods, they fell on the food, and Reuben made himself look away from that, because some things a person shouldn't watch, even when watching them, is how sympathy gets planted deep. He learned their story in pieces over that first hour, Sikya doing most of the talking once her hands had finally come down, her Spanish rough but workable, filling gaps with her hands when the words wouldn't come. Their rancheria had sat 3 days' ride into the Chalk Bluffs, a small camp of maybe 40 people who kept mostly to themselves and wanted nothing from the towns below but to be left alone. A sickness had come through in the spring. Nobody in the camp had a name for it, only fever and red-streaked skin and a cough that drowned a person from the inside. And it had taken the elders first, then the children, then nearly everyone else. Sikya was 24 and had buried her own mother with her own 2 hands. Tama, sharp-eyed, hair-cropped, ragged, was 21 and had lost a husband of 8 months. Nita, the youngest at 19, had lost both parents within 3 days of each other and had not fully stopped shaking since. The 3 of them, and a handful of others too weak to travel far, had gone down out of the mountains looking for a doctor, for medicine, for anyone at all willing to help. What they found instead was 3 separate towns that wanted no part of them. In the first, a thrown rock had opened a cut above Nita's eyebrow before anyone had spoken a single word to them. In the second, they were chased out by dogs and shouting before they'd gotten past the first row of buildings. In the third, an old woman spat at Tama's feet and told her there was no place for Apaches within 100 miles of decent people, and a knot of men followed them clear to the town line with stones already in their fists in case following alone hadn't made the point plain enough. By the time they found the empty cabin at the foot of the Chalk Bluffs, the others who'd started out with them had scattered or turned back or simply not survived the walking, and it was just the 3 sisters left, hiding in a house that wasn't theirs, surviving on rabbits from Tama's snares and berries in creek water, going on 2 months now, waiting on a winter that would kill them outright once it arrived. You could stay. Reuben said it plain, and watched all 3 of them go still in a different way than before. The way people go still when they've heard an offer too good to be anything but a trap. Cabin's got room. I don't need all of it. Why would you do this? Sikya's voice had sharpened back to a point. Reuben looked at his own hands before he answered, turning the question over like he hadn't expected to be asked it, though later he'd admit to himself he had been asking it silently his whole life. Because I know something about being alone that nobody wants around. My folks passed when I was 17. Fever, same as what took yours more or less. Ranch I had after that failed inside 3 years, because a man can't run cattle and grieve at the same time. Not properly. Towns have looked at me like I was something to be managed instead of somebody on account of what I'd lost. and I swore if I ever had a roof of my own, nobody standing under it would have to live scared in their own shelter. No conditions past helping keep the place up, sharing what there is to share, looking out for each other same as anybody would. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then quiet, testing the words like she wasn't sure she trusted her own mouth to carry them, Sikya answered that they would need to see he meant it. And that first night Reuben took his bedroll out to the cold porch instead of sleeping inside, his saddle for a pillow, so that 3 women who had learned the hard way what men did in the dark could sleep behind a closed door without wondering. If a stranger's kindness already has you leaning in, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name. It helps keep more stories like this one coming. The days that followed took on a shape none of the 4 of them could have predicted a week before. Reuben worked the small stretch of pasture behind the cabin, mending fence, turning what soil could be turned before the ground hardened toward winter. Tama, once her suspicion wore down from a wall to something more like a fence with a gate in it, proved to have a gift for traps that put Reuben's own clumsy snares to shame, and inside a week the cabin held more meat than the 4 of them could eat in a sitting. Nita, still quiet, still startled easy by loud noises, found something close to peace turning the hard soil beside the porch into a garden, her hands steadier in the dirt than anywhere else, coaxing squash and beans out of ground that had given Reuben's own half-hearted attempts nothing the season before. And Sikya knew the mountains the way Reuben knew the inside of a bunkhouse, completely in her bones. She showed him which roots could be boiled down for a fever, and which would put a man in the ground faster than the fever ever would have. She could read a sky 3 hours before a storm broke it open, knew which berries a bear would fight a man for, and which weren't worth the trouble. Some evenings she spoke of her mother without meaning to, small details surfacing between the practical lessons, the particular way her mother had braided sweetgrass into a basket rim, the songs sung low over a cradle board, the patient hours spent teaching a daughter to tell one root from its poisonous cousin by scent alone, long before the world ever asked that knowledge to save anyone's life. Reuben listened to all of it and said little, understanding without being told that the telling itself was a kind of gift he hadn't earned yet. When his gelding came up lame, a hoof gone hot and swollen from an infection Reuben couldn't name, it was Sikya who knelt in the mud beside the animal a good hour, working a poultice of crushed leaf and clay into the wound, murmuring low words to the horse in a language Reuben didn't understand, but somehow found himself trusting anyway. Her mother had taught her the healing plants, the way her mother's mother had taught her mother, a line of women stretching back further than anyone in that yard could count. And it was the first time Reuben heard something like pride in her voice rather than grief. "You saved him," Reuben offered 3 days later, watching the gelding put weight on the hoof again, testing it careful across the yard. "He saved himself. I only knew what to give him." But she was almost smiling when she said it, and Reuben was starting to understand that a smile from Sikya was a thing a man had to earn, one small kindness at a time, and that he wanted very badly to keep earning it, evening after evening, for as long as she'd let him. There was a morning not long after when Reuben rode east instead of into Larkspur Hollow, 3 days out to a trading post at the county line where nobody knew his name or his business, and on a whim, half-testing something he hadn't put words to yet, he brought Tama and Nita along with him in the wagon bed. He watched them the whole way. They're braced for the same cold shoulders and hard stares that had followed them out of 3 towns before. And instead, the man behind the counter simply weighed their cured hides, same as anyone else's, made his offer, and counted coin into Tama's palm without a second glance at the color of her skin. It was such a small, unremarkable transaction that Reuben nearly missed how much it mattered, until he caught the look on Nita's face in the wagon on the ride home. Quiet wonder, like she'd forgotten such ordinary fairness, was a thing the world still had in it somewhere. He didn't say much about it that night, only told Sikya over the fire that the world outside the Chalk Bluffs wasn't uniformly cruel, only that Larkspur Hollow had a particular sickness of its own that hadn't caught everywhere yet. And Sikya had listened to that with an expression he couldn't quite read, somewhere between hope and old well-earned caution. She had heard kind words from strangers before, she told him eventually, in the careful voice of someone laying out an old wound for inspection rather than sympathy, and kind words had never yet kept a single stone from finding its mark. What she needed, she said, wasn't more promises about how the world might be. It was time and proof, gathered slow and patient, the way a person gathers proof of anything worth trusting. One honest morning after another, stacked up until the pile got too tall to knock over with a single bad afternoon in town. It would be dishonest to say the town below the Chalk Bluffs didn't notice, because Larkspur Hollow was the kind of place that noticed everything, and a man who used to come in for supplies twice a month suddenly needing enough flour and salt pork for 4 mouths instead of 1 was not a thing that stayed quiet for long. Reuben made his trips alone at first, careful, saying little, but it took less than 3 weeks for Silas Merrick, who ran the mercantile and considered himself something close to the moral center of the town, to put the pieces together from a careless word dropped by a ranch hand who'd seen smoke rising steady from the old Bellamy cabin's chimney. Far more smoke than one man alone would need. "You're keeping Apaches out there." It wasn't a question, and the store had gone quiet around them. Every head turned. "I'm keeping people who needed a roof, same as anybody would." "Those aren't people, Hartley. Those are the ones raiding stock clear from here to the territory line, and you've gone and invited 3 of them to sleep under your own roof like they're kin." Merrick's voice had climbed loud enough to carry to the street. Reuben held his own voice level, though his jaw had gone tight. "These 3 buried their whole camp to a sickness and got stoned out of 3 towns for the trouble of asking for help. They haven't raided anybody's stock. They've been hiding in an empty cabin, surviving on rabbits." "That's not the story I heard." "Then you heard it wrong." Merrick didn't sell him his flour that day, and within the week the boycott had spread quiet but total through every business in Larkspur Hollow. No feed, no dry goods, no nails for the fence still needing mending. Nobody willing to so much as look him in the eye on the street, as though whatever he'd caught out at that cabin might be catching. Reuben rode 2 extra days to the next county over just to keep the 4 of them fed, and told none of the women what it cost him, though Sikya, sharper than he gave her credit for those first weeks, worked it out easily enough from the new lines around his eyes and said nothing either, only worked twice as hard at the garden and the traps to make what they had stretched further. Colt Ashby was not, by most accounts, a cruel man in the ordinary run of things. He paid his hands fair, kept his own fences mended, had buried a wife of his own some years back, without ever once turning that grief into meanness the way some men did. But he was a proud man and a frightened one underneath the pride, and when 11 head of good cattle turned up dead or vanished in a single bad month, the notion that wolves alone could account for it sat worse with him than the notion that somebody was to blame, somebody he could ride against, somebody whose fault it could plainly be, rather than simple bad luck a man had no power over at all. It might have stayed there, A quiet, grinding unkindness a stubborn man could simply outlast if that fear of Ashby's hadn't found the perfect shape to pour itself into. The moment a shepherd's careless story about the Apaches out at Hartley's place reached his ears, giving that fear a target it could finally aim at. Far more satisfying to blame Apache raiders sheltered a half-day's ride from the fence line than to blame wolves nobody had actually seen. Ashby could turn a rumor into a righteous cause inside a single evening at the saloon, and by dusk 2 days later, 20 men had gathered at the edge of town with torches lit against the coming dark and stones already gathered in fists and saddlebags. Riding for the cabin at the foot of the chalk bluffs like men riding towards something they'd already decided was justice. Reuben heard them before he saw them, the low grind of that many horses moving together, and by the time he'd crossed the yard, the torchlight was already visible, cresting the low rise east of the cabin. A string of small orange fires strung against the dusk like something out of a fever dream. He didn't have time to think, only to move, putting himself on the porch steps between that oncoming line of riders and the door behind him. One hand raised, the other hovering near nothing at all because he hadn't thought to bring a gun, and it was too late now to go back for one. Hand over the Apache women, Hartley, and there won't be any trouble here tonight. Ashby reined up 30 feet off, torchlight throwing his face into hard orange relief. Behind him, the other 19 fanned wide across the yard, a half circle closing slow, stones visible in more than one raised hand. This is my land. I'm not handing anybody over to anybody. Then you're a fool standing between good men and what's owed for 11 head of stolen cattle. Nobody in that cabin has touched your stock. You lost cattle to wolves, same as every rancher in this county's lost stock to wolves since before I was born. And you know it. The first stone came without warning, catching the window frame beside Reuben's shoulder and shattering glass across the porch boards. And in the half-second of silence that followed, before the shouting climbed back up to fill it, the door behind him opened and Sikya stepped out to stand at his shoulder, close enough that he could feel her trembling, though her chin was up and her eyes were dry and fixed on Ashby like she meant to memorize his face for the rest of her life. You are the most foolish man I have ever known. Low, not taking her eyes off the mob. And you're the bravest woman I've ever met. Just as quiet, and neither of them moved an inch. Get the women out here or we'll come in and get them ourselves. The half circle drew tighter, torches lifting. Then you'll have to burn me down with the house. Loud now, carrying clear across the yard, and beside him Sikya's hand found his, gripped it hard enough to hurt, and neither of them let go. For one long, terrible moment, it looked like the mob would come anyway, torches dipping forward, the front rank of horses stepping closer, and Reuben found himself doing the arithmetic of exactly how many stones a man could take, standing between a door and 20 angry riders before the door itself stopped mattering. Then a single voice cut hard across the yard from the direction of the road, sharp enough that every head in the mob turned toward it. That's enough. All of you, stand down now. Dr. Amos Whitfield rode in at a hard trot, still in his shirt sleeves, his black bag bouncing against his saddle like he'd left his own supper table at a dead run, and he put his horse directly between the front rank of riders and the porch with a fearlessness that seemed to surprise even Ashby. Colt Ashby, I have delivered 3 of your children into this world and set 2 of your broken bones, and I am telling you now to turn this mob around before I'm forced to remember every single one of you by name in front of the circuit judge come spring. Doc, this isn't your business. This is Reuben Hartley's private property, bought and paid for and recorded at the land office. And the law says he decides who lives on it, same as it would for any of you. I did not treat half this town for the fever 2 winters back to watch it burn a man's house, down over cattle that wolves ate. Go home, all of you. Nobody moved for a long, taut moment. Torches guttering in the wind, and then slow, one rider at a time, the mob began to peel away, muttering, stones lowered but not forgotten, until only Ashby remained a moment longer, staring hard at Reuben and Sikya, standing together on the shattered porch, before he too wheeled his horse and rode into the dark, calling back something about how this wasn't finished that nobody bothered answering. Dr. Whitfield stayed only long enough to look over the broken window and refuse a cup of coffee twice before finally accepting one. And it was there at the kitchen table an hour later, with Tama and Nita finally coaxed out from the back room, where they'd been holding each other in the dark, that he said the thing Reuben would remember longest. He didn't much care, he told them, turning the cup slow in his hands. What a man's neighbors believed about who deserved a roof. He only cared whether the man was telling the truth about it, and Reuben had told the truth every single time he'd been asked a question that night, and that, the doctor said, was rarer than most of Larkspur Hollow would care to admit. Winter came on hard after that, the kind the Chalk Bluffs were known for, snow stacking waist-deep against the north wall by the second week of the new year, and the 4 of them settled into something that had stopped feeling like an arrangement and started feeling, slowly, without any single moment marking the change, like a family. Reuben chopped wood until his hands bled through the calluses. Tama kept the traps running even through the deepest drifts, coming back some mornings with her eyebrows crusted in frost and a grin on her face anyway, proud of whatever she'd caught. Nita, no longer flinching at every loud noise, took to sitting close by the fire in the evenings with Reuben's one battered book of Psalms, less for the religion in it than for the shape of the letters, and Sikya was teaching her to read them in exchange for lessons in her own tongue that Reuben found himself picking up slower, but no less eagerly, practicing words for fire and water and thank you under his breath while he split kindling. The worst storm of that winter hit without much warning in the second week of January, wind screaming down off the Chalk Bluffs, hard enough to peel a section of shingle clean off the north side of the roof in the black middle of the night. And all 4 of them spent 3 frozen hours by lantern light hauling planks and nailing canvas over the gap, while snow drove sideways into the rafters and the fire guttered dangerously low behind them. It was Tama who thought to lash a rope between the porch post and the woodpile so nobody lost their footing in the whiteout crossing back and forth, and Nita who kept the fire alive on scraps and prayer while the other 3 worked, and by the time the wind finally dropped toward dawn and the roof held, the 4 of them collapsed together in a heap of borrowed blankets in front of the hearth, too exhausted to speak, and Reuben remembered thinking, half asleep, that he had never in his life fought for anything alongside people who fought back that hard for him in return. Some nights after that, the 4 of them sat up late over a shared pot of stew, Tama telling some exaggerated story about a fox that had outsmarted 3 of her best snares in a single week, Nita laughing behind her hand at the parts Tama clearly embellished, and Reuben found himself thinking, more than once, that he could not remember the last time this cabin, or any cabin he'd ever lived in, had held this much noise, this much warmth, this much simple, ordinary happiness. He did not say so out loud. He did not need to. Sikya's eyes would find his across the fire in those moments, and something passed between them that neither of them had a word for yet, in either language. It was a small thing at first, the way Sikya's hand would find his while they worked the woodpile side by side, a brush that lingered half a second longer than the task required. It was a small thing. The evening his axe slipped on a green log and opened a shallow gash across his palm, and the way her hands went perfectly steady even as her voice shook, scolding him for his carelessness, binding the wound with a poultice and a strip of clean cloth torn from her own sleeve because it was closer to hand than his. It was a small thing, the two of them sitting up long after Tama and Nita had gone to sleep, talking low by the banked fire about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. Her memories of the rancheria before the sickness, his memories of a ranch he'd once dreamed of building into something worth handing down. And it was only slowly. The way snow builds a drift one flake at a time, until a man looks up one morning and cannot recall the ground beneath it. That Reuben understood he had fallen in love with a woman who had once held her hands up to keep him from taking one more step into her life, and was now the only person whose footsteps he wanted to hear crossing that same floor every evening for the rest of his own. Sikya, for her part, would say later that she had known before he did, that she had watched it happen in him the way she watched weather come over the peaks, slow, then sudden, then simply always there, the way a man's whole bearing changes without him ever once noticing it. Changing, the set of his shoulders easing, the careful distance he'd kept those first weeks quietly closing itself, day by ordinary day, until there was no distance left worth naming. What she hadn't expected was how long it would take her to trust her own feeling back, after 3 towns had taught her that trusting anyone outside her sisters was a door that only ever opened onto stones. It was Nita, of all of them, who said it plainest one evening, while the 2 sisters lay awake in the dark of the back room. Reuben looked at Sikya the way their father had once looked at their mother, Nita said, quiet, like the whole world could burn down around him so long as that one person was standing in the middle of it. Sikya hadn't answered. She hadn't needed to. If this kind of story is why you keep coming back, become a channel member. Tap join beside the channel name. It takes 10 seconds and means a lot. The sickness came to Larkspur Hollow the way sickness always seemed to come to that part of the territory. Quiet at first, easy to dismiss until it wasn't. It started with the livestock, 2 milk cows dead within a day of each other out at the Pruitt place. No wound on either animal, only a strange lethargy, and then nothing at all. Within the week it had jumped to people, the very old and the very young first, a red rash climbing from the ankles, fever that wouldn't break, a cough that rattled deep and wet in the chest. Dr. Whitfield worked himself past exhaustion, trying every remedy his training had ever given him, and none of it slowed the thing down even a little. And by the 10th day, 3 elders were dead, and Mayor Otis Pruitt's own grandson lay burning with fever in a back bedroom the whole town had begun speaking of in hushed, frightened tones. It was Whitfield himself who rode out to the Chalk Bluff cabin, hat in his hands before he'd even dismounted, looking older than Reuben had ever seen him. He addressed himself to Sikya directly, not to Reuben, a thing she would remember and be grateful for long after that day had passed. He knew what this town had done to her family, he told her plainly. He knew he had no right whatsoever to ask what he was about to ask. But he was asking anyway, because he was out of ideas and out of time, and because somewhere in that mountain knowledge of hers there might be something his books had never taught him. Sikya stood a long moment in the cabin doorway, and Reuben, watching her, understood he was witnessing something too private and too enormous for him to have any part in deciding. He knew what it would cost her to walk back into a town that had thrown stones at her sister's face for the crime of asking for help. He knew, too, that whatever she chose, he would stand behind it without a word of argument either way, because it was hers to choose, not his to grant. "Where do the animals drink?" she asked at last. "The creek behind the Pruitt pasture mostly. Same water half the town draws from further down." She nodded slow, something working behind her eyes, and told him simply to take her there. She rode into Larkspur Hollow that afternoon for the first time since the day she'd been chased out of 3 towns just like it, past storefronts where people who had once looked through her like smoke now watched with something closer to fear and shame in equal measure, and she did not once look away from any of them. At the creek behind the Pruitt pasture, she walked the bank slow, crouching here and there to examine the mud, until she found what she'd been looking for a quarter-mile upstream, a thick tangle of low, broad-leafed plants with a distinctive purple vein running through each leaf, growing in a dense mat right where the water pooled slow before continuing on. "This," she pulled one leaf free and held it up. "My mother taught me of this plant. It hides among the good ones, and if the water sits too long, too still, it leaches something into it that poisons anything drinking there. Slow at first, so nobody notices until it is already inside them." "You're certain?" "I am certain enough to stake my sister's lives on it, which I am already doing simply by standing here." Something in her tone left no more room for the doctor's doubt. They cleared the plant from the bank through the rest of that day, and into the next, Reuben and Tama working alongside Whitfield, and a handful of men too frightened by then to object to whose hands were doing the clearing. And Sikya moved through the sick room of Larkspur Hollow the way her mother must once have moved through the sick room of a mountain camp, boiling roots into a bitter tea, packing crushed leaves into poultices, sitting up through 2 full nights at Mayor Pruitt's grandson's bedside with a patience that had nothing left to prove and everything left to give. The first night was the hardest, the boy's fever climbing instead of breaking despite everything Sikya tried, and she sat through it without once leaving his bedside, cooling his skin with damp cloths, coaxing the bitter tea past his cracked lips, a spoonful at a time whenever he stirred enough to swallow, murmuring the same low words to him she'd once murmured to Reuben's lamed horse, as though sickness in a boy and sickness in an animal both answered, in the end, to the same patient kind of care. By the 2nd day, the rash had stopped spreading. By the 3rd day, the fever in the boy had broken, and word of it moved through Larkspur Hollow faster than the sickness itself ever had. Families who'd crossed the street rather than pass near Sikya a month before now, sending their own sick children out to the Pruitt house and asking, quiet and humbled, whether the Apache woman might look at them too. By the 5th day, every elder still fighting for breath was breathing easy again, and the last of the cattle showing symptoms had begun, slowly to recover. Not one person in that town owed their recovery to Reuben Hartley. Every one of them owed it to the woman his neighbors had once tried to drive off with torches, and Reuben made certain, in every telling of it afterward, that nobody in Larkspur Hollow forgot whose knowledge had actually saved them. The town gathered in the square the following evening, not with torches this time, not with stones, but with a silence that carried a different weight entirely. Something closer to shame finding its way, awkward and unpracticed, toward gratitude. Elias Cobb, who had founded Larkspur Hollow with his own hands 40 years before, and whose word still carried more than any elected office in it, stood up on the mercantile steps with his hat in both hands. He had lived in this valley longer than most of them had been alive, Cobb told the crowd, and he had watched them do a shameful thing to 3 women who never once asked for anything but to be left in peace, and then asked for nothing at all when the town needed saving and gave it to them anyway. He looked directly at Sikya, standing a little apart from the crowd with Reuben at her shoulder, and said he did not know that this town had any right to her forgiveness. But he was asking, on behalf of every fool who'd thrown a stone or turned her away, that she and her sisters stay on that land at the foot of the bluffs as long as they wished, under this town's protection instead of its fear, for as long as any of them drew breath to offer it. Mayor Pruitt, his own grandson alive and pink-cheeked at his side, said little, only nodded once, hard, and that nod carried further through Larkspur Hollow than any speech could have. Even Silas Merrick, standing at the back of the crowd, would not meet Sikya's eyes. But he sent a wagon of supplies out to the cabin 2 days later, without being asked, and never spoke against her again. Sikya did not answer Cobb's apology with any grand speech of her own. She had not come down out of the mountains that week looking for the town's forgiveness, and she said as much, plain and unadorned, standing there in the square with her sisters at her back, that she had come only because a boy was dying and she'd had it in her power to stop it, and that whatever the town chose to feel about that afterward was the town's business, not hers to manage or accept on anyone's behalf but her own. It was, Reuben thought, watching her say it, the truest thing anyone had spoken in that square all evening, and it seemed to land on the gathered crowd harder than any gratitude could have. The plain fact that her help had never once been conditional on their deserving it, only on a child suffering being a thing she couldn't walk past. Even cold Ashby came eventually, though not that first evening. It was closer to a month later, on a gray afternoon when Reuben was mending fence alone along the eastern boundary, that Ashby rode up slow and dismounted without being asked, turning his hat over once in his hands before he managed to say any of it. That he'd been wrong about the cattle, wrong about the women, wrong in a way that had nearly gotten a man burned out of his own home over a mistake that belonged entirely to him and to nobody else. He didn't ask to come inside. He didn't ask to meet Sikya face to face, seeming to understand, in his own halting way, that some debts aren't repaid by the person who's owed them, but simply carried quietly from then on. He left a young steer tied to the fence post as some clumsy, wordless apology, and rode off again without waiting to be thanked. And Reuben never mentioned it to Sikya at all, only turned the steer loose into their own small herd and let the gesture speak whatever it was going to speak on its own. Spring came slow to the Chalk Bluffs that year, the way it always did at that elevation, snow retreating grudging and gray from the high passes, while the valley floor below had already gone green. Reuben stood on the porch he'd rebuilt with his own hands. The window Ashby's mob had shattered, long since replaced with good glass, hauled up from a town that had learned, hard and late, what it had nearly cost itself. Tama rode in a Larkspur Hollow herself now, unafraid, trading cured hides for coffee and calico at a mercantile counter where she was greeted, if not warmly, then at least honestly. Nita had grown steady enough in her reading that she'd taken to helping the school teacher's youngest with their letters 2 afternoons a week, a thing that would have seemed impossible to imagine on the frightened, trembling girl Reuben had first found, huddled against a cabin wall a year before. Reuben found Sikya standing alone one clear night at the edge of the pasture. the last of the snow silvering the high peaks under a full moon. The whole valley laid out quiet below them, and he came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. I keep thinking about the day I walked into that back room, and you told me not to take one more step. I remember. I was ready to put a knife in your ribs if you had. I believe you. He was quiet a moment, watching moonlight move slow across the snow. I keep wondering what would have happened if you'd done it. If I'd never gotten past that doorway. Then you would be a fool with a knife wound, and I would still be hiding in a cold cabin waiting to starve, and neither of us would know what we know now. Sikya turned to look at him. Nothing guarded left in her face at all. None of the wariness of that first terrible afternoon. Only something open and certain that had taken a whole hard year to build. We were never meant to find each other the easy way. I do not think people like us get the easy way, but we were meant to find each other. A strange family we've made. He was thinking of Tama's traps and Nita's careful letters, and the wood he'd split with hands that had finally learned what it meant to work for people instead of merely surviving alongside them. The best family. And there under the full moon in the mountains that had once hidden her only in fear and now sheltered her in something closer to peace, she let her head rest against his shoulder, and Reuben understood that whatever this was between them, not a wedding day, not a ceremony any church in Larkspur Hollow would have recognized, but a belonging built one small kindness at a time, out of shared bread and split wood and a knife lowered slow in a dark back room. It was already and would remain the truest vow either of them would ever need to make. Behind them up at the cabin, lamplight glowed warm in the window Reuben had rebuilt, and somewhere inside it Tama was teaching Nita a new stitch of beadwork that had been their mother's, and their mother's mothers before that, a pattern of small triangles meant to represent mountains. The same mountains that had once been the only thing standing between the three sisters and the men who'd wanted them gone, and were now simply home, stitched in careful colored glass into a strip of doeskin by firelight. It was Nita who had asked that same evening whether they might teach the pattern to any daughters who came along someday, and Tama had laughed and said that was getting ahead of things, and Sikya, overhearing from the porch, had said nothing at all, only smiled the private smile that Reuben had spent the better part of a year learning to earn. A small unbroken thread carried forward out of a burned rancheria and 3 towns worth of stones, and into a home nobody could take from them now. 4 lonely souls who had started as strangers and ended against every hard lesson the world had tried to teach them, as something that looked a great deal like family, and felt on quiet nights like this one under the Chalk Bluff moon, like it might just be love. If Sikya and Reuben stayed with you tonight, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name, and thank you for riding this whole trail with us.